Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the third lecture, that is about elasticity. And in this topic, we basically study the responsiveness of demand and supply to the changes in its price. We can actually measure how responsive the demand of a commodity would be to change in its price. So it's important to know this concept. And what I would expect you to learn after going through this lecture is that you understand and estimate the price elasticity of demand. So it's important to understand what is this concept and why the businesses need this concept to understand, to make better strategies. Next, we need to learn what are the determinants of the price elasticity of demand. We need to learn a relation between price elasticity of demand and total revenue of the businesses. And there are other kinds of elasticities that I would also be covering along with the price elasticity of demand, and those would be like cross price elasticity of demand, where we talk about the two substitute or two complementary commodities. That means what happens to commodity X if there would be a change in price of commodity Y, so two related commodities. Then I'll be talking about income elasticity of demand, that is what happens to the demand of a commodity when the income of a consumer increases. And also I'll be talking about elasticity of supply, which means how responsive the supply of a product would be to the changes in its price in the market. And finally, we'll be discussing how to use this concept to analyze economic issues, and that is the main objective of today's discussion about elasticity. Now, there was an article about the taxation on cigarette, and the article said, okay, cigarette tax to increase 25% from midnight. And just go through the article, and especially the highlight box. It says that the health minister interpreted or says that tax increase will encourage about 2 to 3% of the smokers, or 87,000 people, to stop. Now, the interesting thing here is about this article that actually this can be measured, that a 25% increase in tax can lead to 2 to 3% of smokers to quit smoking. Now this is interesting, which means whenever government frames a policy like, okay, there should be an additional taxation on tobacco, there should be an additional taxation on a demerit good like alcohol. So whenever government plans of making such a policy, government can actually predict with the use of economic analysis that, okay, with this much of the tax on this particular commodity, this will lead to this percentage of people to quit that demerit commodity. So basically, it's interesting to know that how the governments, the companies, the economists can measure the impact of a policy. So elasticity, the concept of elasticity actually helps us in understanding how we can measure the impact of a policy. So I'll discuss this case in the workshop as well. Now, I have a question for you. The question is, do people actually care about the price of petrol? Now think about this. Whenever the price of petrol increases, we complain a lot, but then we keep on filling our tanks and spending more on the fuel. So we actually basically reallocate our budgets, and we try to change the consumption pattern so that we keep on spending more on petrol even when the price increases. So is it the case that we don't care about the price of petrol, or is it the case that because petrol is such a necessary commodity that we cannot live without it, and hence no matter if the price changes, we don't have any other option, so we keep on spending and keep on consuming petrol regularly? So I'll be discussing this case with you with the help of some extra articles in the workshop as well. So we'll discuss this. Okay, so some of the theory part, why we need to understand elasticity is because if we don't understand the concept of elasticity, I don't think we'll be in a position to use that concept to have economic analysis. So let's try to understand the concept of elasticity. Now, if you're managing a small firm or a large business, it is, I believe, is essential for you to know how an increase or decrease in the price of your products will affect the quantity consumers are willing to buy. That means whenever companies, whenever firms, whenever businesses, they change their prices, sometimes they increase the prices to attract more sales or to get more revenue basically. So sometimes to collect more revenue, they use a policy of increasing the price because they know that consumers don't have other options, so they'll keep on buying. And if they continue buying the product, they can actually raise their revenue by increasing the price. And sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes the companies use the policy of cutting down the price so that they can attract more people, more customers for their product, and then they want to increase their sales and hence generate more revenue. So at a point in time, it is basically a point of interest to know whether you should be increasing the price of your product or you should be cutting down the price of your product if you want to generate more revenue by the sales. So that basically depends upon the elasticity of the product we are talking about. So if you don't understand the elasticity of a product, you cannot frame a policy of increasing or cutting down the price of a product to increase more revenue. So it's important to understand what kind of commodity we are talking about in our business and how much is the elasticity of that product. So we need to understand that, okay? So next is what would happen in the case of different goods. For example, you are into a business of petrol. So what would happen if you increase the price or cut down the price? If you're selling water, if you're selling cigarettes, luxury cars, medicines, books. So it basically it is important to understand the nature of the commodities, what kind of commodities we are talking about before we frame a policy of changing the price of that product. And the concept of elasticity actually gives you an answer. So the basic idea is you understand the nature of the commodity, whether it is less elastic, more elastic, and then you take a decision that what should be the pricing strategies to enhance our revenues for the business. Okay, let's go back to lecture 2. So lecture 2 we discussed that the law of demand is a law that states that there is a negative relation between the price of a commodity and demand for that commodity, other factors remaining constant. But the interesting question is, okay, we understand that there is a negative relation, and we also understand that whenever the price would go up, the demand would go down. But the important thing to understand here is how much. So we actually want to measure that, so that if I decide to increase the price of my product by $100, can I actually measure how it's going to impact the demand? By understanding the law of demand, I know that it's going to impact the demand in a negative way, but it would be important to know if I increase the price by $100, how much the demand for my product is going to go down. So basically, elasticity is a tool that can help you measuring that this much would be the change in demand if you change this much the price. So basically, we're trying to measure the law of demand, okay? So to measure this, we need to know how responsive the demand and supply are to price. So basically, we need to understand the responsiveness of demand to the price of a product, the responsiveness of the supply to the price of a product, okay? Price elasticity of demand. If I talk about elasticities, there are basically 4 types of elasticities, and the most important among them is the price elasticity of demand, because this is elasticity that actually helps us in understanding the relationship between between the demand and the price. So law of demand states that, okay, there is a negative relation, but how strong is this relationship? This can only be measured with the help of concept of elasticity, and this specifically saying this would be the price elasticity of demand. Now, elasticity, what is elasticity? We all know what is elasticity. It is a term used in economics to explain the effectiveness or responsiveness of one variable to changes in another variable. And if I talk about price elasticity of demand specifically, it is the term used to explain the effectiveness of or responsiveness of the change in demand to a change in price. Now, it is important to know here that price elasticity of demand is always negative. Why it is negative? Because there is always a negative relation between price and demand. Basically, we are talking about the necessary commodities here. So normal commodities, the price elasticity of demand would always be negative, okay? So 4 types of elasticities: price elasticity of demand, income elasticity of demand, cross elasticity of demand, and finally price elasticity of supply. And I'll be going through each one in a short while. So the first one is price elasticity of demand. Obviously, it is the responsiveness of the change in quantity demanded of a good to change in its price, ceteris paribus. Now, it is about measuring the quantities. So measuring the quantities means we need to do some calculation, and there is a formula for calculating the price elasticity of demand. So the formula says that the price elasticity of demand is equal to percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. And it is important to note that the price elasticity of demand is not same as the slope of a demand curve. Though the slope says, okay, there is a negative slope of the demand curve, which means there is a negative relation, but we cannot actually measure the relationship by simply looking at the slope. So we need to have a formula for that, and this is a formula that we use to measure price elasticity of demand. So percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. Now, okay, we got the formula here. So if the demand changes by 10%, what we need to do is 10% divided by, say, the price changes by 5%. So 10% divided by 5% would give you a coefficient of price elasticity of demand. But before we calculate the price elasticity of demand, it is important to understand this formula before we apply it. So the important thing to know is, number one, that the price elasticity is always negative. Why it is negative? I have already told you it is negative because we're talking about a negative relation between price and demand. But we are usually interested in their relative size, so we ignore the negative signs and take the absolute values only. So what I'm trying to tell you here is, whenever we measure the price elasticity of demand, it would always be a negative coefficient. But for simplicity or for our convenience, we ignore the negative sign and we talk about the absolute value of the term. So, for example, if I say the price elasticity of demand is -3 of one commodity and -2 for another commodity, if I consider the signs, the -3 should be different to -2. But basically, because it's negative, so -3 would be smaller than -2. But I am only interested in the absolute value. So I'll ignore the signs and I'll consider the coefficients as 3 and 2. So 3 would be bigger than 2. Okay, so we ignore the signs, but we know in our minds that it is a negative coefficient, irrespective of whether it's written there, the negative sign, or not, but it is always a negative coefficient. But for simplicity, for calculations, we simply ignore the negative sign. Now, the second important thing here to understand is, in the formula we use percentages, and there is a reason for that. If I don't take percentages, and imagine if I take say changes in quantity demanded of a commodity, that would be in a different unit. And if I talk about changes in price, that would be a different unit. So we cannot actually calculate this if we are having different units in the numerator and denominator. So we want to get rid of the units, basically. So as a solution for that, what we do is we measure the percentage change in demand and percentage change in price, and by doing that we make this formula independent of the units that the commodity might have. So basically, by using the percentages changes, we get rid of the units and we come up with a simple solution that would actually would be easy to understand. Okay, 10% change in demand leads to 20% change, 10% change in price leads to 20% change in demand. Would be easy to understand and would be free from the units as well. So that is the reason we use the percentage changes, and it is quite helpful as well. Okay, so elasticity types. We have got basically 5 types of elasticities, but two types of elasticities are the most relevant and more practical ones, and that is the first one and the second one, whereas third, fourth and fifth are the rare cases, but we actually need to understand all of them. So less elastic and more elastic are basically the realistic situations. So less elastic, number one, less elastic is also called as relatively less elastic, or we can also call it as simply elastic. So what is less elastic? It is basically a percentage change in quantity demanded when the percentage change in quantity demanded is less than the percentage change in price, which means when change in demand is more than the change in price, then it is, the change in demand is less than the change in price, then it is less elastic. More elastic is when you, for example, if you change the price by 10% and demand changes by more than 10%, so it would be more elastic. Unit elastic is when the change in demand is exactly equal to the change in price. Percentages changes, of course. So if you change the price by 10% and the demand also changes by 10%, but it's hard to find real life examples related to unit elasticity though. Perfectly inelastic, where the change in price leads to no change in quantity demanded, means we are talking about such a necessary product, such a necessity, that whatever happens to the price, we don't react by changing our demand. So change in price leads to no change in quantity demanded. Okay, perfectly elastic is any increase in price causes quantity demanded to fall to zero. That means there will be one given price and there will be different demand levels on that price, but if you change the price, the demand, there is a possibility the demand might fall to zero as well. It's hard to find these three, unit elastic, perfectly elastic and perfectly elastic in real life, and the more realistic are less elastic, more elastic. Okay, so let's have a diagram here for less elastic. So the price is $3 and the demand for smoothies is equal to 10 units. So what happens here is a large fall in price. That is, if the price drops from $3 to $1, it leads to smaller increase in demand basically. So what I'm trying to tell you here is change in price is more than change in quantity demanded. So demand is not very responsive, as the change in demand is actually less than the change in price. So we call this kind of situation as a relatively less elastic demand curve. And if you measure the percentage change, actually the price changed by 67% and quantity changed by 50% only. So change in demand is less than the change in price, and in this case we call it as relatively inelastic or relatively less elastic curve. So price fell from $3 to $1 and quantity increased from 10 to 15. So if you measure that, you'll get a coefficient of 0.75. Now again, this is a negative coefficient, but we don't need to write down the sign there, and we take the absolute values only. More elastic, okay, so a small fall in price leads to a larger increase in demand. So demand is more responsive here, as price falls by 33% only, but the demand changes by 100%. So the change in demand is more than the change in price, and we call this as demand is relatively more elastic. And likewise, if you measure the coefficient, it comes out to be 3. Now, meaning of coefficient, that means how we interpret the coefficient. So if the elasticity coefficient is 3, this would be interpreted in a way that 1% change in price results in a 3% change in quantity demanded, which means we are talking about more elasticity here. Okay, so I'll give you a thumb of rule, right? We have a chart here, and every time if you're thinking about what would be the elasticity of the commodity, you actually take this coefficient example there. So if the elasticity of demand coefficient is greater than 1, then demand is elastic, or we call it as relatively more elastic. Whereas if the coefficient comes out to be less than 1, then we call the demand as inelastic or relatively less elastic. And if the coefficient comes out to be 1, which would be rare, then the demand is unitary elastic. So that should be the thumb rule, that you look at the coefficient, and if the coefficient comes out to be greater than 1, we are talking about more elasticity. Less than 1 means less elasticity. Okay, so perfectly inelastic demand means demand would not change with different prices. So we fix the quantity here, we fix the demand here. For example, so imagine you spend $50 every week on petrol, no matter what the price is. That means you're fixing the quantity that you would be buying, no matter what the price would be. So basically, perfectly inelastic demand is hard to find, but yes, this could be relevant in case of the basic necessities. Like, I'll give you an example here, like the insulin. If I'm a diabetic patient and I have to take insulin, I would not change the quantity of that insulin if the price changes. So I'm fixing the quantity of the insulin that I need, and I try not to change that because of the change in price. Okay, so an increase in price leaves the quantity demanded unchanged, and we call this coefficient elasticity of demand is equal to 0. So basically the elasticity of demand can be 0 if we are talking about perfectly inelastic demand. And okay, let's discuss the examples with inelastic demand. For example, necessities, habit forming goods. I'll be discussing these examples within the workshop. So think about the commodities that you believe are the necessities and within elastic demand: beer, wine, tobacco, petrol, basic foods, bread and milk. And with the perfectly inelastic, I can only give you an example. For example, the medicine or the insulin that we normally take, and we don't change the quantity of that insulin. Perfectly elastic, which means any change in price can lead to fall in demand to 0 as well, which means the demand remains at a level at a given price, and elasticity of demand in this case would be equal to infinity. So basically the range of elasticity of demand is from 0 to infinity. It can be 0, it can be infinity, it can be 1, it can be greater than 1, it can be less than 1. Now, goods with elastic demand would be basically the goods where we react a lot, and these are the goods basically that are very expensive, or luxury goods, for example designer labels, jewelry, entertainment. And whenever a recession comes in an economy, these are the commodities that would be hit hard by the recession and not the necessities. So these are the commodities where firms need to think 10 times before they change the price, because consumers are going to react immediately. Elasticity along a linear demand curve. I told you in a previous slide that elasticity is different to slope. So what I'm trying to tell you here is, even on the same curve, there will be different points of elasticities. Okay, so in this curve, elasticity can range from 0 to infinity. I'll explain you how. So if we talk about this point here, that is this point here. So we're using the formula that lower segment of the demand curve, which means this whole demand curve divided by the upper segment, which means 0. So anything divided by 0 is equal to infinity. So at this point of at this point of the demand curve, the elasticity would be equal to infinity. Okay, here elasticity would be equal to 0. A midpoint, here elasticity would be equal to 1. Here it will be more elastic because it's greater than 1. And here it would be less elastic because it's less than 1. So elastic, inelastic, or we can call it as more elastic or less elastic or inelastic. Okay, so different elasticities on the same demand curve. The formula that we use to measure the elasticities on the curve or between 2 points, for example this point and this point, we use the midpoint formula, and which is equal to change in demand divided by the average demand, whole divided by change in price, and further divided by average price. So that is the formula basically, which is known as midpoint formula, and this formula is being used when we want to measure the elasticity between 2 points on the same demand curve. You would not be required to use this formula or to calculate this formula for some problems. Instead, we just need to understand the concept, and we need to understand how we apply this concept in real life, and not about calculating. So we're not concerned about calculating, but we're trying to use this concept for the economic analysis. Okay. Now, this is important. Okay. Whenever you want to decide that what should be your strategy to generate more revenue, whether you should be increasing the price of the product or you should be cutting down the price of the product, answer lies in what kind of commodity we are talking about. And once we decide, okay, this is the type of commodity, then we look at the elasticity of that commodity, and how we know how elastic that commodity is. Basically that depends on these factors. So whenever I give you an example of a commodity, you think about the about these features, and then you'll be able to judge whether the commodity is less elastic or more elastic. So these are the determinants that would determine the elasticity of a product, whether it would be more elastic or less elastic. Okay, so availability of close substitutes. For example, if I'm talking about say coffee from two cafes in the same campus, so they are close to perfect substitutes to each other. So if one of the cafe increases the price of the coffee, I think we all would be jumping to the other cafe where the price is still the same. So more the close substitutes available to a commodity, more will be the elasticity of the commodity. Length of time involved. So if we're talking about change in the price of petrol today and change in demand today, I think we won't be responding to that change in price. But more the time involved, we can actually invent the substitutes that we can replace our product with. So more the time available, we can think of the substitutes that we can use, or we can think of some other sources that we can replace the product with. But less is the time involved, we cannot have those options, so we will be less elastic. So more the time available, more will be the elasticity. Necessities, less elasticity. Luxuries, more elasticity. Definition of the market, the broader definition would be the one, for example, if I'm talking about pizza as a whole. And the narrow definition of the market would be like I'm talking about pizzas by Domino's or Eagle Pizzas. So narrow the market, more will be the elasticity. Broader the market, less will be the elasticity. Okay. Share of expenditure on the good in consumer's budget. So this is important too. If I'm talking about a commodity where I spend just say a small portion of my income, like salt, or say anything where I spend just a small proportion of my income, there the elasticity would be less. But if I'm talking about a car, or if I'm talking about buying a house where I would be spending a major portion of my income, there I'll be more responding to the changes in the price, so the elasticity will be more there. Elasticity and total revenue, this is important from the business's point of view, because we want to actually understand, we want to know what should be our strategy to increase revenue. So before that, we need to understand what is total revenue. So total revenue is nothing but equal to price into quantity. So if I sell 10 units and the price of one unit is $2, so the total revenue that I can generate would be $20. So price into quantity will be equal to total revenue. Now the question is, will a fall in price leads to an increase or decrease in total revenue? So answer, of course it depends on the concept of elasticity. We need to understand that concept to give an answer. So what happens if the commodity is inelastic? Remember I told you that the most relevant cases of the elasticity are more elastic and less elastic. So I'm not going to talk about perfectly inelastic, perfectly elastic, or unit elastic. Instead I'll be talking about less elastic or more elastic only. Okay, so let's say we are talking about inelastic demand. So there is a positive relation between price and total revenue if the elasticity is less. That is, if you increase the price, your total revenue will increase, because we know that consumers don't have any choice. They'll keep on spending money on the product, and if you increase the price, they'll still be buying the product, which means they'll be paying more, buying the same, which means we can generate more revenue. Elastic demand, there will be a negative relation between price and total revenue. That is, if you increase the price, you'll actually lose the revenue. So beware of changing the price if the commodity is a commodity where you believe that the consumers will just shift in a minute from your product to some other product. So if demand is elastic, a 1% price cut increases the quantity sold by more than 1%, which means the total revenue increases. If demand is inelastic, a 1% price cut increases the quantity sold by less than 1%, which means total revenue decreases. And if it is a unit elastic, then 1% fall in price leads to 1% increase in quantity, which means the total revenue does not change. Okay, so I told you that there are different elasticities on the demand curve itself. So this is the total revenue of any firm. So, excuse me. So what happens is, if we look at the total revenue of any product for a company, for a business, total revenue first increases, and then it reaches a maximum, and then it falls down after a level. So what happens with different elasticities? What happens to the total revenue here? So we are talking about price here and DVDs quantities being sold here. So when the demand curve is elastic, that means when we are talking about this part of the elasticity, so when the demand curve is elastic, then the revenue will increase. When the demand curve is unit elastic, revenue remains same, and when the demand curve is inelastic, then the revenue falls down. So with different elasticities of the commodities, the total revenue would be increasing, decreasing, constant, based on how elastic the commodity is. So it's just a repetition of what I have been talking. So you can go through these tables, and believe it would be easy for you to understand. Now I can show you the total revenue with the help of a model, but before that it is important to understand that if we are talking about two demand curves, and if the demand curve is flatter, so the one with the flatter demand curve will have less elasticity. I'll give an example here. Sorry, the one with the flatter will have more elasticity. So an example here, total revenue is equal to price into quantity. So price into quantity. So this one is, this portion here is the loss in revenue by cutting down the price, and this portion here is actually gain in revenue because the quantity increased due to fall in the price. So this loss in revenue and this is gain in revenue, which means we can actually compare the loss with the gain here. If you're talking about less elastic demand curve, which is steeper and not flatter, so this much would be the loss in revenue, and this much would be the gain in revenue, basically. Okay. So the third type of elasticity, the second type of elasticity is cross price elasticity of demand. And cross price elasticity of demand is a concept where we measure the responsiveness of change in demand of commodity X when the price changes for commodity Y. So basically this concept works for two types of commodities that are related to each other. Now the related commodities could be the substitute commodities, or these commodities could be the complementary commodities. So what would be the coefficient of cross elasticity? It would depend upon whether we are talking about two substitute commodities or we are talking about two complementary commodities. But before we discuss that, let's try to understand the formula for the cross elasticity. The word is cross, which means we are talking about cross commodities, which means we are talking about two commodities basically. So the formula would be percentage change in quantity demanded of commodity X divided by percentage change in price of commodity Y. So we are talking about two commodities here, and the assumption is these two commodities like X and Y, they are related to each other in some way. They could be substitutes, they could be complementary. Okay, so percentage change in quantity of X divided by percentage change in price of Y. If we are talking about substitutes, that means if you're talking about two commodities that serve the same purpose, then the cross elasticity of demand coefficient would be positive. And if you're talking about two complementary commodities like car and petrol, printer and ink, there we basically, coffee and muffin, so there we basically talking about two commodities that go hand in hand. So cross elasticity of demand coefficient would be negative in case of complementary commodities. So I'll give you an activity here with following types of commodities, and you decide on whether the elasticity coefficient would be positive or negative. So for that you need to understand what kind of relation the two commodities are having. I'll just give you an example for the first product, and rest you can try to explain. Coke and Pepsi, so they are close to perfect substitutes. So the substitutes means the elasticity coefficient would be positive. Okay, so again an example, unrelated means printers and peanut butter, for example. So there might be two products that are unrelated to each other. So in that case, the change in price of one will never lead to any change in the demand for the second commodity. So in that case, we'll say the cross elasticity is equal to 0. Okay, so the next type of elasticity is income elasticity of demand, and this concept measures how much the quantity demanded of a good responds to change in consumers' income. So we're talking about if my income increases by $1,000 per annum, how much would I spend more on food, on petrol, on clothing, and so on. So basically we are talking about when people become rich, how much they buy more of the commodity. So percentage changes in quantity demanded of any commodity divided by percentage change in income. Okay, so that is income elasticity of demand. And if you want to talk about the coefficient of income elasticity of demand, it could be positive, it could be negative. Now the coefficient for income elasticity of demand would be positive if the commodity is a normal commodity, which means I spend more if I become rich. And the coefficient of income elasticity would be negative if I'm basically talking about, say, inferior commodities. So if I'm talking about a commodity that I am actually using only because I don't have more money to use better products, then I'm talking about negative coefficient of income elasticity. Okay. Finally, here's the concept of price elasticity of supply. So this is a concept that measures the responsiveness of quantity supplied to change in price. That means if price changes, how much you would like to supply more of that commodity. So now we are trying to understand the behavior of the producer, not the behavior of the consumer. So the formula would be percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in price. And the coefficient could be greater than 1, less than 1, as we discussed the elasticity of demand concept. So if the coefficient is greater than 1, then the supply is elastic or more elastic, or we can call it as relatively elastic. And if the coefficient is less than 0, then we'll say that the supply is inelastic or relatively less elastic. Determinants of price elasticity of supply. So it depends on availability of inputs. So more inputs available to me as a supplier, as a firm, the more responsive my supply would be to the changes in the prices. Existing capacity of production. So imagine if I'm using all of my resources and if I'm producing at the full capacity, then I think the elasticity of supply would be least, which means no matter what the price, what happens to price, I cannot increase my supply because I don't have capacity to increase. So it depends on where, what level of production you are. Length of time involved, again, time is the solution for everything. If you get more time, you can actually enhance your supply or you can cut down the supply. But less the time involved, less elastic the supply would be to the change in the price. Type of industry we are talking about. If you're talking about agricultural crops, it takes 7 to 8 months for next plantation to come in. So no matter if I demand more sugar, we all demand more sugar this season, they won't be able to produce more and more sugar unless they have new crops coming in for next year. So, and if I'm talking about something that I can actually easily produce more, then the elasticity will be more. Inventory is held, so it depends on how much I have got in stock. If I've got more in stock, then I'll be more responsive to increase my supply to increase in price. And if I have nothing in the stock, then it would take time to respond to that price change. Okay, so first example, less elastic supply. Less elastic means a large price rise leads to a relatively smaller increase in the quantity supplied here. So supply is relatively less elastic or inelastic. This is the example of more elastic supply curve. So a small price rise by only 20 cents can actually lead to increase in the quantities of pizzas supplied. So this is where supply responds more to the change in price. So we call this as relatively more elastic supply. Perfectly inelastic supply, where elasticity of supply is 0, and perfectly elastic, where elasticity of supply is infinity. Again, hard to find examples of these two extreme cases, but it's interesting to actually understand that, yeah, this might happen in some of the cases. Okay, so that was about the concepts, and now I have a case that I can discuss with you in the workshop. So this is basically an activity for you. So you prepare this answer, and we'll discuss this in the workshop, and I'll have more articles to support, hopefully to support this question here. So the question is, why are oil prices so unstable? So why the prices fluctuate so much? So that is basically the question. Now the low price elasticity of oil supplies helps explain why oil prices fluctuate so much. So I'm giving you a few hints here, like why are oil prices so unstable? Because demand is inelastic, and a decrease in supply causes price to rise more than quantity falls. So basically I'm trying to give you some help here. So just go through these slides, and we'll try to discuss this in the workshop. And we'll also discuss a few articles again that are related to the concept of elasticity. So I hope you go through the lecture before you come in the workshop, and you'll be in a position to discuss about this concept, and we'll try to apply this concept to the real world. So I'm believing that you'll go through the lectures, and then we'll discuss the applications in the workshop. So I'll see you all on